So let's talk Red Armoured Sons of Sanguinius, the Black Rage of the Death Company, and Golden Angels soaring on wings of fire, with a review of Codex Blood Angels in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Blood Angels, and in this video we're going to do a full review of the core rules for the army, talking through all the detachments, datasheets and rules changes. As seems to be pretty often the case with Codexes in 10th edition, there's a few mixed feelings about the release of this one. At first impressions, the detachment and unit rules broadly do look really quite good. It doesn't feel like one of the codexes where Games Workshop has just underpowered everything and made it more boring, which I think is definitely a good thing. But on the other hand, it does feel like it's going to be a painful pill for certain Blood Angels collectors to swallow, mainly just due to being quite a big blow in terms of firstborn models being either phased out or replaced, lots of units lost, and a few of the units that did get updated kind of got updated in a slightly bland Primaris way. It's not all bad news on the model front, though I do feel like it's less than quite a lot of people were hoping for with the Blood Angels Primaris update that they've got. At time of recording, it's a couple of days until the Blood Angels box goes on sale. The Codex will first be available in the Blood Angels army set alongside a whole bunch of Primaris style Death Company and Lemartes and Astorath. In general, on the theoretical discount front, it looks better than Games Workshop's done in a fair while for these army launch box sets. $230, £140 or €180. If you were looking to pick up the box set, there's a bunch of discount retailers links down in the video description that can save some money. Anything bought through them does go to help support Auspex Tactics a little. Here are the release times for those retailers as to when the box set's going live. If you are looking to pick one up of these, it might be worth being early. The Deathwing Assault box did sell out really quite quickly, though obviously we don't know how much Games Workshop will have made of this just yet. In any case, a massive thanks to you folks who do use those discount links when you buy things for Warhammer. It does save a bit of money versus Games Workshop and helps keep all the videos coming on this channel. Let's get into the book properly though, and in Codex Supplement Blood Angels, these are the contents. You have the standard lore and miniature galleries that you get in each codex. There's the Crusade and narrative combat. There's the combat patrol rules, the one with that new captain and Sanguinary Guard and assault intercessors in it, though in this video I'll be focusing on the core rules for the army. As a Codex supplement, the book is designed to be used alongside Codex Space Marines, so this one has all the unique Blood Angels units in it, or at least the ones that remain after the firstborn phase out, and a lot of more standard Blood Angels units will be found there, such as things like the Jump Intercessors and the Assault Intercessors, which have been pretty popular competitive picks for them recently. In the book, it's the similar sort of pattern to the Dark Angels, so 3 different detachments here, all of which have the normal format of a core detachment rule, 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems. One of the interpretation of the index rules with balanced melee support, one that's mainly Death Company focused, and one that's jump pack and mobility focused, with one stratagem that helps out Sanguinary Guard in particular. At first impressions, all of them look at least pretty interesting. Then for datasheets, there aren't loads here. There's 15 datasheets in the book. Previously there were 19 in the index, though it really kind of means that 7 have been lost given that there's essentially 3 new captain datasheets here. 1 regular one on foot, and 2 Death Company variants. Lots of datasheets have been removed, which hasn't pleased many. One of the most notable casualties is the Librarian Dreadnought, and basically every other firstborn character that didn't have a new shiny Primaris sculpt, so characters like Gabriel Seth or Brother Corbulo. Finally, there's a printed point section at the book, which is redundant at launch. Games Workshop released these as a digital download when the book actually goes live. If they stick to previous patterns with this might not be until the main Blood Angels release, which will be after the launch box weekend. I'll certainly cover it on the channel, but it does mean that the points that are printed in this book might not be entirely accurate. Usually they're most useful for giving us a rough idea as to what the enhancements would cost, though even those can change, and as a result we'll be in the position where we know basically all the rules for how to field the army, but we won't actually have the points cost yet. Let's jump into it though. And first up, we're starting with a core army rule, which is the same for all Space Marines as Oath of Moment. The standard Astartes damage buff that you declare in your command phase, and then your units get extra damage against that one nominated target. You get to reroll all hits against the unit that you nominate, so it means that usually it's a 33% damage boost if you were hitting on a 3+ originally, though it's a little bit less useful for certain units out there. Say for example Death Company already reroll hits in melee anyway, and say Dante with Sanguinary Guard, they'll be hitting on a 2+, so for units like that it doesn't have quite as much impact. Still can be pretty powerful though, very strong for when you just want to go all in on demolishing one target with a powerful melee squad. Maybe some Sanguinary Guard without Dante, or a big unit of Vanguard Veterans or Jump Intercessors perhaps. And of course it's kind of helpful if you want to focus a bunch of shooting on some things. Fairly standard stuff for the Space Marines there. Then moving swiftly on to the detachments, as mentioned in Codex Blood Angels we have 3. The Liberator Assault Group is the renamed Sons of Sanguinius detachment from the Index. This one's balanced aggressive melee, and to be honest, for the new rules I'd say it arguably looks like it's got better rather than worse, which is kind of surprising given that they were already top tier in terms of tournament performance. Then we've got the Angelic Host, which I think also looks interesting. This one has rules to help jump pack units. All the rules support them, and the core mechanic allows jump pack units to jump on and off the board with wings of fire, and there's plenty of interesting deployment and movement tricks. Finally, we do have the Expected Lost Brethren detachment, which is the one for Death Company. This one basically has all its boosts revolve around the Death Company datasheets in the Codex, and gives them a bunch of handy melee tricks, though at least at first impressions I'm not sure that those melee tricks are necessarily better than the Liberator ones, even though they are locked to a smaller subset of units. Your Death Company on foot also get the battle line keyword in this, so you can field loads if you want to. As ever with detachments in 40k, none of these lock out any Blood Angels units. You could still field, say, a tank column in the Death Company detachment. You just wouldn't really be getting any detachment benefits for anything besides the Death Company, as that's what all the rules work on. You do have the usual Space Marine restriction though, in which you can't mix and match chapters. So say you can't go taking Marnius Calgar or a bunch of Space Wolf Thunderwolves in the Blood Angels detachments, as they belong to other chapters. Blood Angels can use all the other detachments in Codex Space Marines without restriction at the moment as well. Of these, it generally tends to be the Gladius Task Force that gets the most interest. The selling point of that is having access to easy advance and charge in the past, plus quite a nice melee stratagem and the fire discipline combo. I feel like with the addition of this codex though, it's probably going to become even less relevant, given that each one of these detachments has an advance and charge option in it. And I feel like Gladius will probably fall even further behind as a result, as it was already being played less than Sons of Sanguinius when they didn't have advance and charge. Probably for the best that the themed detachments do outcompete the generic codex, at least for Blood Angels though. It perhaps felt a bit sad for the Dark Angels, when it still seems that Gladius is the strongest way to play them, at least at the time of recording. Let's get into those detachments though, and first up we have the Angelic Host. This is the jump pack themed one. Certainly no bad thing to be really focusing on jump units, seeing as they tend to be first and foremost in the Blood Angels army in general. And between the options from the core codex and the ones that they have in this book, you do have lots of jump units to put on the table. It's not too small a section of the army. The core rule for this one, it sort of takes a leaf out of the Grey Knight's book, and it's basically up on Wings of Fire, a return to reserves mechanic for jump pack squads, where it's the same idea where you can take units off the board at the end of the enemy turn, provided they're not in engagement range. You can do so with more units at bigger battles. At Incursion it's 1 unit per turn, at Strike Force it's 2, and Onslaught it's 3. These units return to the board in the reinforcement phase of your next movement phase, and they do so via Deep Strike. At first glance this really is quite a powerful redeploy option, means that you can have your jump units bouncing all over the board and always pushing on the front lines if they want to be. Bear in mind that like with Grey Knights for this, it might not be quite as good for melee units as you might think at first glance. 9-inch charges just aren't reliable. Even with a command point reroll, it's around about a 50-50 coin flip, and you don't really want your scary melee units just sat out in the open. Though Dante with his +1 to charge could make it an 8-inch with a reroll, which at least gives you a 2/3 chance of getting in. On top of that, I'd also bear in mind that this detachment, like the rest, has an advance and charge stratagem, so it does mean that your on the board position for your jump units is probably going to be quite good anyway. They'll be able to make some seriously long charges across the board. Occasionally it might be useful for melee units pushing their way forward, but I feel like it's actually going to be more useful if anything for objective support, having things like small squads of jump intercessors bouncing around the board, doing secondary objectives, and putting themselves in positions to screen and annoy the enemy. And it seems particularly great for Inceptors as well. They get their 3-inch deep strike, so each time they do deep strike they can drop really close to the enemy. Potentially you could have a couple of units of them jumping around the board, dropping super close to an enemy unit and deleting it while hopefully staying in cover, and then going back into the sky and doing so all over again. That could be some seriously scary stuff there. Overall I feel like it's an interesting detachment rule. Pretty intimidating that the Blood Angels army could be bounding back into the sky every time they feel like they're not in the optimal position. Then for stratagems for the army, we've got 6. First up, let's start with that advance and charge one, Death from the Skies. A jump pack unit can shoot and charge after advancing or falling back, though weirdly enough it states that it's declared in your charge phase, and that's after any shooting happens, so I guess it's a little bit broken at launch. I guess that will have some obvious errata, such as you can declare it in the shooting or charge phase. As mentioned though, this one really is pretty spectacular. Advance and charge is massive for jump pack units. It means that with average rolls you'd be pushing around about a 22-inch charge threat range, maybe a little more. and that means that a Blood Angels unit in a somewhat forward ruin on the board could be making a charge against something really quite a long way away if you do have a command point to give them. Next up, we've got Armour of Contempt, which is your standard Space Marine and worsen AP by 1 for attacks made against this unit this phase. Standard Space Marine stuff there, but it's often a genuinely very useful one. Most of the Blood Angels units can make great use of it. Assault Intercessors and Death Company might often mean that they're saving on something like a 4+ rather than a 5, or a 5 versus a 6, and that can leave a few more left to strike back in melee or something. And it's pretty nice for Sanguinary Guard as well with their 2+ save, though at least they'll get their 4+ invulnerable save now. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Unbridled Ardour. This one's the Sanguinary Guard specific one, and you use it when an enemy unit has slain one of your jump pack units. For the rest of the game, for 1 command point, any Sanguinary Guard units gets 2 reroll hits and wounds against that nominated enemy unit, so it looks like it would turn their damage from pretty good to just stand out amazing against that squad. Rerolling hits and wounds when put together can often mean around about double damage, so that is pretty spectacularly better. It is going to be dependent on your army though. You're going to actually need some Sanguinary Guard in the army if that one's going to be useful. The enemy unit that destroys your unit has to be worth using the debuff against. If it's something really fragile, it probably doesn't matter. Any Sanguinary Guard units in your army will actually have to reach that unit by the end of the game, so even then it might not be an absolute auto-include. Occasionally though, seems like it could be really good. Say a big scary enemy Death Star unit moves up and deletes a jump infantry unit that was holding a mid-board objective, and then the Sanguinary Guard are just holding back or ready to counterattack with extreme prejudice. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Descent of Angels, which is a massively powerful one. This one gives you a 3-inch deep strike, and you can do that either out of standard reserves or after using your Angelic host on Wings of Fire. Again, it's often not going to be one that necessarily helps things get to melee, as you can't charge after. Like with the detachment rule though, it's kind of awesome for objective play. It means with a few units of jump intercessors, you could basically repeatedly 3-inch deep strike into the enemy deployment zone and harvest loads of victory points for things like behind enemy lines and established locus. I guess it could occasionally be used with bigger units though, maybe something like a big squad of Sanguinary Guard or Death Company, using it to drop somewhere weirdly safe at the back of the enemy army. Perhaps take up residence in a big unit where the enemy is not going to be able to shoot or charge them with anything that's meaningful, and then when it gets back to your next turn, have them all ready to press the attack. A really nice one for objective shenanigans in any case. For 1 command point, there's a damage dealer one called Martial Exemplars. A jump pack unit gets lethal hits and precision in the fight phase. Lethal hits is pretty nice, particularly given this one doesn't give you the Liberator group damage boost. If you're wounding things on a 5+, it's usually a 50% damage increase, so it will be good against things like knights or vehicles. And precision is a pretty helpful option as well, used for a very different purpose, and you can judge whether or not it's worth it to stack your squad's damage all into one enemy leader character. Occasionally it might be the best choice with things like, say, Orc Pain Boys, when you can get rid of a powerful durability rule, or other things that you can reliably kill that are giving the enemy squad a massive boost. Finally, for the Angelic host stratagems, there's one called Angel's Sacrifice. This one is one of those ones where it forces the enemy units to attack this unit and this unit only. Again, you have to use it on a jump pack unit, like say some jump intercessors. And the way it works is that any model with an engagement range of the unit that you've nominated has to attack your unit, so it does mean that other units not in engagement range of them could be able to fight elsewhere. The idea that you'd use this for would be to have a weak or depleted jump pack unit tank damage for another one. Maybe a good example could be if you had to deal with Lionel Johnson, who has fights first. Charge him with a squad of 80-point jump intercessors and make it so he has to attack them, and then also at the same time charge him with a massive squad of tooled up Sanguinary Guard or something. So the enemy big threat has to waste all their damage destroying the light unit, all ready for your big scary units to take out the major threat. Definitely an option that has some big shenanigans, though admittedly in the Codex, your cheapest jump infantry squad are going to be at least 80 points or so it's not really like you're stopping them from doing any damage at all. Overall though, I think that this is a really strong set of stratagems. I'd say literally every single one of these has enough value to see some good use. Some might be a little bit more niche, like the Unbridled Ardour Sanguinary Guard one. An Angel's Sacrifice might require you to do a bit of specific setup if you want to get the best value out of it. But between advance and charge, 3-inch deep strike, and units jumping on and off the board, it's a ridiculously mobile army that can really get jump packs exactly where they need to. Finally, for the detachment, we've got 4 enhancements. The Gleaming Pinions is the only technically new one, I guess. The other 3 are kind of lifted from Sons of Sanguinius out of the index. As with the rest of the rules, they're all only for jump pack models. You can't take them on ground-bound captains or things. First up, I probably would say that the Gleaming Pinions is the most interesting looking one. It's jump back only, and you get a reactive normal move of 6 inches for the bearer's unit if the enemy finishes a move within 9 inches of the model bearing it. It's listed at only 10 points in the Codex, and as mentioned, we don't know that that's going to be the final points cost yet, but if so, it seems basically auto-include on some jump character, which I'm sure you'll have in this detachment. It's maybe not 100% guaranteed that you'll get good value out of this, but when you do, it could be absolutely immense. Say for example you have a scary jump pack unit, jump into the midboard, destroy an enemy unit on a midfield objective, and then try and finish up their combat phase near a ruin. If the enemy then moves up to try and claim that objective and triggers this rule, that 6-inch move means that you could just zoom your squad back behind a ruin so they can't be shot anymore, or even if you're playing a melee army, just move 6 inches directly further away from that enemy unit and make their charge longer by 6 inches, which could often mean that they fail it. If it really is just 10 points, then this one seems absolutely reasonable to have on just about any jump pack character that you're fielding. Otherwise, we've got the Archangel's Shard listed at 20 points here. A melee weapon gets anti-chaos 5+, and the Lance keyword. At 20 points, I'd say it's usable but not crazy standout. Lance is useful, and I guess it means that you could have a Power Fist that wounds enemy knights and things on a 4+, which definitely isn't nothing. The anti-chaos bit might not be super relevant, though could be good if you're using a Thunder Hammer maybe. The Codex jump pack captain can take one of those, so I guess that could be helpful. I feel like this one's okay if you just want to add a bit more threat to a massed up jump squad of some sort. Next up, we've got Artisan of War, which is 15 points. Again, this one is basically a port from Sons of Sanguinius. It boosts the AP of all your weapons, range and melee by 1, and also gives you a 2+ saving throw. Again, reasonable enough. The extra AP will help against certain targets, like say when you're fighting enemy Space Marines, and particularly ones that can use Armour of Contempt. A pretty reasonable points filler if you have them left over. And finally we have Visage of Death. This one's changed a bit since the index, where it was previously a half objective control type relic. Now instead it's a battle shock generator, and it generates battle shock for each enemy unit in engagement range at the battle shock step of the enemy command phase, provided it's not a monster or vehicle. That is quite a helpful time to trigger it, as it's basically just before the opponent scores points. On occasion this could mean that if you've got an ongoing combat, suddenly the enemy just fails battle shock, they can't score their objective, and they might have to test Desperate Escape if they want to fall back as well. Realistically though, sometimes you might just wipe out the entire enemy unit, or they might wipe you out in return. Most of the time they are going to pass that battle shock test, and if it's in the battle shock step, I guess they could Insane Bravery it as well. I feel like again this one could be an alright points filler if you've got 10 points left over and a spare character. It's probably not something that I'd massively plan around actually working out though, given that the odds are they're just going to pass the battle shock test either way. Overall, I feel like maybe picking up the Sons of Sanguinius index enhancements wasn't the best strength for this detachment. They did tend to be a bit mediocre and not all that commonly played. I'd say the biggest winner for this one is easily the Gleaming Pinions, which can give one squad a massively nasty movement shenanigan. The rest all feels just kind of merely fine as points fillers, unless it winds up being dead cheap when the final points come out. Overall, it does look like a fun detachment. I'm not sure if it's going to outweigh just the sheer rage that you can mete out from the Liberator group, but it definitely has some interesting things to draw you to play it, including fairly godly secondary objective support. Moving on, next up we've got the Death Company detachment, and this one's called the Lost Brethren. Again, like the Angelic Host one, it's very much Blood Angels of one flavour. Literally every rule and every enhancement can only be given to Death Company units, as the whole army is themed around them. Death Company Marines and Death Company Marines with bolt rifles both gain the battle line keyword. These are both the versions on foot, so essentially the ones with the chainswords and the ones with the bolt rifles, and both can take those shiny new eviscerators, as we'll see. The core rule for the detachment is called a Noble Death in Combat. Each time a Death Company model from your army makes a melee attack, you get to reroll wound rolls of 1 if your squad is below starting strength, and if the model's unit is below half strength, then you get to just fully reroll the wound roll instead. So it's basically damage buffs as your squad takes more damage. I must admit I did find this one a bit on the disappointing side really. It's just going to be a rule that comes up so much less often versus the Liberator Assault group's big damage on the charge. And even if your squad does satisfy the condition and has taken a bit of damage, then it's going to be far less powerful than the charge boost that the Liberator gets. Rerolling 1s to wound isn't nothing, but it also isn't much, equating to around about a 16% damage boost. On top of that, for an army like Blood Angels, where you've got big investment jump inventory moving around, often things will be jumping out into the open, causing carnage but then getting fully wiped out. There's a good chance that your opponent doesn't just politely leave your Death Company units half killed, even if it does happen just occasionally kind of randomly. On top of that, unlike the Liberator group, it's only applying to Death Company and not to any of your other assault units that you might have, and also it doesn't even apply to one of the Death Company units realistically. given that the Death Company Dreadnought with its Twin Fist or Talons already has full wound rerolls, so the detachment rule has no benefit for that. Just kind of a shame for this one really. It does mean that the reasons to play this detachment are going to be in the stratagems and enhancements, if anything. The detachment rule definitely isn't nothing, but it is going to pale into comparison with the carnage that you can get out of the more general Blood Angels detachment. Taking a look through those stratagems, first up we have Armour of Contempt as normal standard stuff here. That's the only stratagem that can be used on anything that isn't Death Company, the rest are all locked to units with the Death Company keyword. Next up we've got a rule doubling down on the detachment rule. A Death Company unit that's below starting strength gets +1 attack, +1 strength and an extra pip of AP when they're fighting in melee. Their weapons also gain hazardous unless they're near a chaplain, though I feel like in this detachment you are going to have a bunch of chaplains on the board to herd all the Death Company in the general direction of the enemy. This one is really quite a nice damage buff. The +1 attack and +1 AP are generally going to be useful, and the +1 strength thing might be a little bit more variable. At any point when it does translate into +1 to wound though, this stratagem is going to be kind of godly. The only downside to it is the same one as the detachment though really. The Death Company unit has to have taken damage, but also kind of taken so much damage that it's no longer worth using the stratagem on anymore. It's just a bit sad that you can't cause maximal carnage with this with a full squad charging in that hasn't been hurt yet. For 1 CP we've got Final Retribution. This one's a fight on death on a 4+ if you haven't already attacked, and as per normal for these ones, it's declared when your unit is attacked by the enemy unit. As ever, things get better when there's chaplains around to coordinate. You get a +1 to the roll if there's a chaplain nearby. This one is pretty handy to have, to be honest. As a pretty much dedicated melee army, this one's a very nasty counter melee stratagem. Say you have a scary close combat unit that chooses to wipe out one of your units in melee, this means that you should hopefully be able to take down a good chunk of them as they go down. And again, I feel like with this detachment there's a good chance that chaplains will be on hand to give all your Death Company objective control and the flexible ability to fall back and things. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Glorious Sacrifice. This one's a sticky objective rule. When your unit gets gunned down, 1 Death Company unit slain on an objective that you control, that marker then remains under your control until the opponent controls it at the start or end of any turn. Often this can be a pretty direct trade out in terms of a command point for some victory points. If your opponent guns down a Death Company unit on a far-flung objective, that objective can then stay yours and will continue to do so until the opponent does something about it. For 1 command point, we've got Furious Onslaught. This one's a boost to the pile-in for a Death Company unit, moving D3 plus 3 inches rather than the standard 3, boosted to 6 inches if in range of a chaplain. You need to wind up within engagement range of an enemy unit after you've made a move like this, so you can't use it, say, if the enemy unit had got wiped out before that, to then go doing big consolidates onto an objective unless you wind up in engagement range. Pile-ins are handy enough. I feel like it could have been a bit better if it was both pile-in and consolidate, but this one will give you a big boost to making sure that all the Death Company models can fight. Occasionally your squad might be strung out a little bit, and some important miniatures might not be able to make it in. Plus can be handy enough for tagging other enemy units that are nearby, say engaging with just a few of the models, and then using the big pile-in to tag other things. That could easily happen with a big 10-man unit. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Wrathful Rampage. This is advance and charge for Death Company, and if they're within 12 inches of a chaplain or below starting strength, you can advance, shoot and charge as well. Overall, I do find it pretty crazy that the Blood Angels can advance and charge in every detachment. It's just such a massive boost to threat range when you can do that on one unit that needs it most each turn. Often the extra 3 or 4 inches that it gets you on average will be enough to engage an enemy unit rather than just fall short and have your fancy Death Company dying out in the open. Overall, I maybe feel just a little bit more mixed about the stratagems for this one. Definitely some good stuff here, but a lot of it perhaps just feels a little bit more situational or not as used every turn. I think my favourite out of them is probably again the advance and charge one for in-game impact. Again though, literally all the rest are usable. I feel like just a few more of them might be kind of reactive as to what your opponent does, say for which units they choose to damage, or whether they're trying to destroy your units at range or melee. I guess it does feel kind of appropriate for the Death Company's whole thing though, dragging down as many enemies as they get killed, and making sure their sacrifice and madness isn't in vain. Finally, we've got the Lost Brethren Enhancements. Again, all of these are Death Company models only, so I guess you'd mainly be looking at the Death Company captains in this book. First up, we've got Sanguinary Grace, which is listed at 20 points here. Once per battle, you get to fight again if your model is in engagement range of 3 models at the end of the fight phase. That could be pretty brutal if you have a captain that's just wading through scores of enemies in a big horde unit. With say a Power Fist with another 5 attacks re-rolling the hit roll, that should be a whole bunch more dead enemies. Kind of a shame it's only against massed up infantry units though. It requires your miniature to be in a specific position within the units to get the boost. I feel like it's one that could be a fun points filler, though probably isn't one to go out of your way for quite as much. Next up we've got the Blood Shard, which is listed at 25 points here. A 2+ chance to revive on death at the end of the phase where they're slain. They get up with 3 wounds remaining outside of engagement range of any enemy units, and this one can be quite a powerful rule. Nice and cheap for an aggressive captain, I suppose. Could weirdly give a Space Marine Death Company captain a bit more play, just literally run solo if you'd like. But perhaps more likely not something that's too bad to throw onto a unit that's going to be playing very aggressively, and there's a good chance they wind up getting wiped out early in the game. Next up we've got To Slay the Warmaster, listed at 15 points in the Codex. Once per battle at the start of the fight phase, roll 6d6 in that fight phase, and an enemy character model in the unit that you're in engagement range takes 1 mortal wound for each 4+ that you roll. This one's kind of fun, I guess the Death Company character going a little bit mad and seeing their foe as Horus as they like to. I feel like the 3 mortal wounds that you get on average, odds on isn't going to be enough to take out the character in one hit, though I guess you could combine it with Epic Challenge as well for a bit of next level character sniping. Between that and a whole bunch of Power Fist attacks, you should be odds on to take out the majority of characters, even if they've got an invulnerable save or something. I feel like this one could be reasonable enough as a points filler. Finally for 10 points, we've got Vengeful Onslaught. If the bear is destroyed, then until the end of your next turn, every Death Company model on the table gets a +1 to hit. And to be honest, that doesn't seem like a bad consolation prize. Getting any sort of army-wide buff, particularly when you're playing mainly Death Company, seems well worth it, particularly for 10 points. I would probably bear in mind though it's probably not quite as good as it sounds really, as you're re-rolling all the hit rolls in melee anyway. You're already going to be hitting the vast majority of the time. To the average squad's damage output, you're only adding +9% to that. It's definitely not nothing, but might not be so much that you actually notice it in a big way. As with the Stands Back Up one as well, I usually have slightly mixed feelings about enhancements that require a character to be slain. To be honest though, if it is just really 10 points as it looks like as it's printed, it does feel like the single best one to have just as a points filler. Any sort of potential army-wide boost that you could get for 10 points pretty much seems fairly auto-include. Overall, for first impressions of this one, I feel like it's probably not going to be as strong as the Liberator group. As you could probably hear from my first impressions, I feel like the core rule is just significantly weaker in terms of when that damage boost triggers. The Stratagems do have genuinely quite good support though, I suppose, and I feel like they'd be the main selling point. A few interesting melee tricks and rewards for when your units get wiped out definitely aren't the worst, and they still get advance and charge. I'd say the enhancements all feel okay, but either being once per battle damage boost or rewards only if your characters get slain, I feel like they are going to be a bit limited. Overall, I do feel like it seems usable, could be fun enough to put a mass Death Company army on the board and roll with the fluffy detachment, though just at first impressions I can't help but think if you are playing mass Death Company, the Liberator detachment is still going to be the stronger one even if you went all in on Death Company. Speaking of which, that brings us to that one. The Liberator Assault Group is the renamed Sons of Sanguinius. Maybe a little bit of an unusual choice of name, feels a bit more all very freedom as opposed to Blood Angels. As with the Index, the core rule is the Red Thirst, and thankfully they did get the boosted version of this that they acquired in the balanced data slate. When your unit makes a charge move, you get to add 2 to the strength and add 1 to the attacks until the end of the turn. And that is a massively brutal melee damage boost, and one that's really easy to trigger with the way that Blood Angels like to make war with their jump packs, maybe jumping out from behind terrain and hitting the enemy with the force of a meteor. The +2 strength was a really big deal to them. Strength 6 is pretty amazing for any strength 4 chainswords that you have out there. You wound Orc Boys and Terminators on a 3+, any hordes of toughness 3 models on a 2+, and most normal sized vehicles on a 5 at least. And it's also great for Strength 8 Power Fist as well, jumping up to Strength 10, another great breakpoint where you're wounding Terminators on 2s and most mainline battle tanks on 4s. Dante might like that a bit more as well, as he'll also be Strength 10 after his strength boost to his axe. The +2 strength is good, and then +1 attack is just always a solid boost, giving you further things to throw at the enemy. And the core rule just gives you a big emphasis on getting the charge rather than being charged, using the speed of jump pack units to deliver that most of the time. And competitive Blood Angels lists have found lots of use for things like captains leading either assault intercessors on foot or jump intercessors, but basically anything else in melee works really well as well. It really is a good core rule, and it was basically enough to carry this detachment to be a strong one, even if before the majority of the stratagems beyond Red Rampage were perhaps a little bit on the mediocre side in my opinion. Talking of which, one small nerf has come to Red Rampage. It looks like now the flavour of the detachment is that it's the army trying to struggle with their red thirst, whether or not they keep the thirst in check and act as the exemplary angels that they strive to be, or give in to the bloodlust momentarily, reap the rewards but also lose control a bit and take some battle shock. There's now several stratagems that you either get one of two different buffs or you can have both buffs, but only if you get automatically battle shocked after. Red Rampage is one of those. It now gives you either lance or lethal hits, or both if you're battle shocked. Getting either one of them is usually still a plus 50% damage increase against anything that you were wounding on a 5+, so it's already a good stratagem at base. As before though, it can turn up a regular jump infantry squad to kind of ludicrous levels of damage, but now the downside is that the squad will be battle shocked after if you double dip with both buffs. Sometimes that won't matter very much, like say if they're not on an objective and not threatening to do secondary objectives or things, but sometimes it might be something that you genuinely can't afford to do anymore. As it goes, I feel like I can live with that change. You can still have all the damage when you want to, but it's now a bit more of a trade-off as opposed to just an absolute also-use stratagem whenever an important melee unit makes combat with something meaty. Otherwise, for one command point, we've got Savage Echoes. This one gives you a little bit of your detachment rule when you get charged. You have to declare it when the opponent charges you, so you don't know how much damage they're going to have done yet, but you can either choose to have either +1 strength or +1 attack. And again, you can take both if you have your unit battle shocked, which often will be kind of fine really in the opponent's charge phase, as when it gets back to your turn, you'll immediately cancel that battle shock, so most of the time it won't have any problems with scoring objectives. As damage buffs go, it could often be pretty meaningful, particularly if the +1 strength translates to +1 to wound. If you get both that and the +1 attack, could easily be worth one command point if you've got a unit that's going to either fight first or survive to fight intact. Could be nice for Mephiston or the Sanguinor, both of which still have fights first, or maybe a Judas here leading some Blade Guard or something. That could make that kind of squad just ridiculously tricky to charge. Overall does seem pretty usable, if maybe a little bit reliant on your opponent having picked a bad combat to fight. Next up, for one command point, we've got Angelic Grace. This one's a save against mortal wounds. You trigger it whenever the squad takes a mortal wound, and then for the rest of the phase they get a 5+ save against them. It's maybe a little bit boring, but maybe not the worst to have. Certain armies that are very into their devastating wounds will be nice. Essentially it equates to a 50% durability boost. Sometimes it's going to be worth it, though sometimes not. We do have the standard Armour of Contempt as well, worsening enemy AP as per normal, and good here with any power armoured units or Sanguinary Guard with their 2+ saves. Then though, we've got the pair of stratagems that I think really do give a serious boost to the detachment. Relentless Assault and Aggressive Onslaught, these both taking leaves out of the Gladius's book really. Relentless Assault allows you to fall back and then either shoot or charge, or both if you take the Red Thirst Battle Shock, and then Aggressive Onslaught allows you to advance and then either shoot or charge, and again both if you take the Red Thirst Battle Shock. Having all those rules as options is just incredibly powerful, and it's one of the things that makes the Space Marine Gladius Force to be one of their best detachments. And this one doesn't just have to be locked to assault infantry as well, you could be using this on say big gun tanks and vehicles where it makes sense. As mentioned, I feel like the advance and charge access is one of the biggest things here. It means that now the Liberator Assault group both hits incredibly hard and also can get there faster than before. I'm kind of surprised that they gave them this, given that they've been doing quite so well previously. It's just going to be far harder to be able to look at a Blood Angels unit and know that you're definitely out of charge threat range for them, or you're just not going to be able to afford to hang that far back. All the other bits are genuinely very powerful though in the right situation. Advance and shoot is great when it means that you get line of sight, range, or get to an objective and you absolutely needed to advance to do that. Could be good on big shooting tanks in particular, maybe say a Gladiator Lancer trying to get a key line of sight. Fall back and charge is going to be great to trigger your detachment buff. It means that a unit that does so will be able to fight first again as they're charging once more, and then also hit with the big +2 strength and +1 attack once again, which is a big difference on their base profiles. And fall back and shoot could actually be weirdly helpful for any Blood Angels ranged assets that you have. Could be handy for vehicle units, so you don't have to remain locked in combat with a foe that you don't otherwise want to, just to use big guns never tire. Or just could be nice with any on the board infantry type things, say Hellblasters who can't shoot anymore because they're being locked up. This way they can just step back and shoot the enemy in the face, and maybe even follow up with a charge if they really want to. Overall between these two I feel like it's a big gain in mobility and utility, and a big gain in strength as a result. Overall I feel like the stratagem section has got a little bit stronger. Red Rampage can still put out the same amount of damage even if it does have a trade-off. These two utility ones are absolutely great, I guess they did come with a couple of trade-offs. They have lost their Fights in Death option and their boosted Consolidate type option, so I guess it has come with trade-offs, but I feel like overall it's looking a little bit stronger. Finally, we've got the enhancements, and first up we've got Rage Fueled Warrior. It's listed at 10 points for this one, and this one's a once per battle damage buff to the bearer's melee weapons getting sustained hits 3. For a character hitting on a 2+, that usually equates to a 60% damage boost on average for that fight phase. Definitely not nothing, but maybe not spectacular. I feel like it would have to be a fairly cheap, something like 10 point filler like this is. And it is kind of swingy as well. You might roll multiple 6s and it'd be absolutely devastating, but you might just roll none in that fight phase at the same time. Next up we've got Gift of Foresight, which is listed at 15 points. Once per battle round, after making a hit, wound or saving throw for the bearer themselves, treat the result as an automatic 6. I'd say it's nice enough and does add some value. Could be good if you're feeding in, say, an automatic lethal hit or devastating wound on the damage front. Could be good for a Space Marine character with a Thunder Hammer like the Jump Captains can take. The saving throw bit is kind of nice as well, and when that does trigger, it means that you'll automatically save at least some damage for your character, as you'll just directly convert a failed save into an automatic save with no need to command reroll or anything. Only affecting the bearer themselves though, just perhaps limits its potential a little bit. It would have been just a bit nicer if it affected the entire squad, as some similar rules do. Seems fine as a points filler. Maybe if you are taking a Thunder Hammer, then the automatic devastating wound could make it a lot more tempting. Next up, and probably the most interesting and scary one out of these, is Speed of the Primarch, which looks like it could be potentially game-changing in the right circumstances. Once per battle at the start of the fight phase, the bearer and their unit can get the fight's first keyword, so basically you'd use this if the enemy's just charged you, and then basically your unit can just jump in and hit them first. Pretty massive that you can essentially have the benefit of a Judaseer for a turn in the unit, and just have that for an enhancement upgrade on a character that's adding something completely different to the squad. And this one really is a very, very big one, I think. For certain scary Blood Angels units, you could just make them near enough impossible to charge, and a really tricky prospect for enemy melee units to take down if they can't lay you low with ranged attacks. This one seems pretty massive and impactful if it's cheap enough. Finally, we've got the Icon of the Angel listed at 10 points. This one's unchanged from the index pretty much. Enemy units must check Desperate Escape tests when they're falling back from the unit, aside from monsters and vehicles, and they take a -1 penalty to do so if they're battle shocked. I'd say this one's a pretty helpful, nice to have if you do need some points filling. You might often be in a situation where you take out one enemy unit and consolidate into the next, something that really wants to get away from you. Being able to cause a few more random casualties on that could be a really big deal. At least if it does remain nice and cheap, that one seems very usable. Overall, it probably does seem to be pretty good news for the Liberator Assault group. Kept the same core special rule that really makes the whole detachment scary in the first place. Red Rampage is still on offer and didn't get toned down as much as it might have done, and then just got some fairly godly general purpose movement options with Relentless Assault and Aggressive Onslaught to be able to flex into all the options that the Gladius combat doctrines do if you can spare a command point or two. That Speed of the Primarch enhancement also looks really quite interesting as well. Could be a very difficult prospect for some enemy armies that are very melee focused to deal with. Overall, I feel like for the Blood Angels Codex they've done not too badly with the detachments. I would say that at first impressions it still looks like the Liberator Assault group is probably going to be the strongest. Just massive amounts of melee threat in combination with some good movement support seems like it's really hard to go too far wrong with, particularly in the context of Blood Angels doing so well with Sons of Sanguinius before. Otherwise though, I feel like that Angelic host is also going to be very strong. Units jumping around the board is going to mean that that's an army that can score loads of secondary objectives really easily. And that could be an interesting thing to weigh up against the sheer carnage that the Liberator group can make. It's certainly a detachment I'd be tempted to try out myself, with all the fun redeploys and close range deep strikes and things. For the Death Company one, that does feel like it's maybe the only one that's perhaps a bit undertuned, at least in comparison with the rest. It does have some good melee support, though I think it is let down by a kind of lackluster core rule. The ones that are dependent on units getting damaged just generally tends to be a bit more underwhelming, unless the rewards for damaged units are really quite massive. Let's move on to the other major half of the codex though, in the datasheets. And first up we'll start with perhaps the least popular changes that have happened in all the units that have been removed. I feel like the Blood Angels range update hasn't been as universally well received as things like the Black Templars, just not quite as complete an update on the things that they had before, and therefore it's meant that a bunch of fun and flavourful options seem to be going the way of Legends. As expected, the Furioso Dreadnought and Librarian Dreadnought have both gone away. That seemed on the cards ever since we knew that the Death Company Dreadnought would now be represented by the Brutalis. Out of the two, I feel like the Librarian Dreadnought will be the more missed out of those. The Furioso feels like it has the Brutalis as its spiritual successor with the big fist or talons. The Librarian one with its fun shenanigans with Wings of Sanguinius that was both fun in 9th edition and 10th will be missed by many, I'm sure. Otherwise, basically all of the characters that didn't get Primaris Resculpts have gone the way of Legends, as is often the case with Sistel Finecast, seeing as they've been gradually winding down that range, and that means it's currently no datasheets in the Codex for Gabriel Seth, Brother Corbulo, Tycho and Tycho the Lost, and the Sanguinary Priest with Jump Pack, as there wasn't a Jump Pack on the new Sanguinary Priest model. Tycho's really no surprise given that he's been fluff dead for a long time and without a model on sale. I'm frankly surprised that he lasted anywhere near as long as he did. Out of the other two, I think that Seth will be missed more by many. A fair few people have collected Flesh Tearers in the past, given that they've had some rule support with things like relics and warlord traits in the past. Plus he's just quite a fun character. I wonder if at some point in the distant future he might return with a Primaris model, which might be much to his own annoyance, I'm sure. In any case, never particularly good news to see quite so much of a range basically go the way of Legends all at once, and it's certainly going to annoy a bunch of collectors who have the miniatures in their armies. Models lost do outweigh the new datasheets gained. We got this new and rather nice Blood Angels captain that was quite a well received model. It looks like two of the datasheets are basically using him, either fielding him as a regular Blood Angels captain or a Death Company captain. As it goes, I think that's quite fun. It allows him a bit of a different wargear access and different special rules for taking the black. Plus there's also a Death Company captain with Jump Pack on offer, which is basically just the standard captain from the book with Death Company rules bolted on. Not as much flavour on the miniature, I suppose, but I think it's still an interesting option to add a bit of flavour rules-wise if they were taking a bunch of stuff away, and could be a good excuse for some fun conversions as well. Otherwise, we've got the units that are sort of half removed or side graded, which are the Primarisified Death Company units. As we know, the standard Death Company Marines with their big flexible bespoke kit is essentially being replaced by intercessors with an upgrade sprue, and I feel like out of everything with the Blood Angels release, that's the bit that just felt a bit lower effort than most to me. With the Death Company being quite such a big and important part of the Blood Angels, I think they probably should have stretched to making actual full sculpt models for them, like they did with the Black Templar Sword Brethren. The upgrade sprue is better than the one that we had for the previous Death Company intercessors at least though, with some chapter iconography and a fun eviscerator thrown in. And now it looks like Primaris Death Company are represented by 3 different datasheets, one jump one assault intercessor style one, and one bolt rifle intercessor style one. All squads able to take those new shiny eviscerators for a little bit more melee power. The Death Company Dreadnought has been updated to the Brutalis stat line, which essentially is a paint job update on that one. Again, might have been nice to see a few more custom parts to make that really look a bit different to the standard model. But essentially I feel like this one was always the update on the Blood Angels Furioso Dreadnought in the first place, and the main wargear options it has do feel very appropriate. It looks kind of fun and terrifying in game as well. Finally, that leaves us with the Baal Predator, which looks like it's the only surviving firstborn model in this codex now. Seems that as with the core codex Space Marines, the Predator tanks will be surviving until 11th edition at least. I'm really not too optimistic for whenever we get the next Blood Angels update though. Somewhere between 2 and 4 years time most likely I guess, as to whether or not this one really sticks around for the extreme long term. Kind of feels like the similar sort of story for plenty of 40k codexes. They genuinely have received a few fun sculpts. Astorath and Lemartes and the Sanguinor are all nice enough I think. The Sanguinary Guard weren't liked quite as much as an update, but it is always a bit sad when you see quite so many of the older Finecast type models or miniatures that fit in with the firstborn get sent to Warhammer Legends datasheets. They'll still be playable with casual games, but the rules will get more mothballed over the years, and that is annoying to players. Remove models aside, let's talk about the datasheets themselves though. As mentioned, you can use any of these and the non-chapter specific ones in Codex Space Marines. For supporting things, Assault Intercessors and Jump Intercessors often be popular for Blood Angels armies. Scouts and Infiltrators are rarely a bad choice to help with objective work, and sometimes having just a bit of sheer dedicated fire support can be pretty helpful, maybe things like Gladiator Lancers as dedicated choices to pop enemy armour, even if as you'd expect most Blood Angels armies tend to run at least fairly assault based. For the actual Codex units, you don't get battle line on any units at base. The Blood Angels unique choices have generally tended to be more sort of anti-elite and frothing mad Death Company. Though as we saw with the Death Company detachment, you can have the Death Company Marines and the Death Company Marines with bolt rifles to get battle line if you use Lost Brethren. Otherwise, perhaps the only other major unifying rule for the Blood Angels is the Black Rage. That's the one that all the Death Company models get, and they all essentially get the same special rule from that. It grants them a 6+ Feel No Pain, which is quite nice for 2 wound infantry being hit by, say, damage to attacks. You get to reroll all hit rolls in melee, so very reliable and very scary there. Previously that used to work at range as well, and that meant that Death Company were kind of weirdly accurate with things like Inferno pistols, though now it's just melee, probably more as you'd expect really. Then it does come with downsides as well, in that they need chaplains to guide them into battle. If they're not within 12 inches of a chaplain model, their objective control becomes 0, and they also can't be selected to fall back either. And I feel like of the two, maybe the objective control is the bigger deal in 10th edition Pariah Nexus games. It'd mean their units wouldn't be able to do actions and things, or hold any primaries. And that could be a really big deal for winning close games that are very mission dependent, as opposed to ones where you're just sweeping the enemy off the table, or vice versa. Finally, before we get into the datasheets, I just mentioned the points once more. The printed points are broadly not relevant in 10th edition codexes. That's the way that Games Workshop have chosen to go with them, and broadly speaking I'd say that's absolutely a good thing. They give you a placeholder points section, which means that the book could be used in, say, legacy games once 10th edition has long passed, and maybe to give you a rough starting point for more casual games. But the thing to look for is the Murator Field Manual being updated when the Codex gets released, and that allows them to actually give the units points values that are at least somewhat in line with the current strength of armies in Warhammer 40k, even if they don't always get it right. I'll absolutely look forward to covering these in a future video, though it could be a little way out at this point. With these previous launch box armies, there's often been the launch box release, then a good wait until the main release, where we'll get things like the Blood Angels Combat Patrol and Sanguinary Guard and the Sanguinary Priest and things. And then the official points should drop shortly after that. It is just a little bit irritating that we find out about the full rules for the Codex though, and then we have to wait quite a while before we've got official points for the way that they want them to be used. That's more of a case of Games Workshop treating these launch boxes as sort of like a preview sale as opposed to the main event. In any case though, we can certainly get to grips with the units and how they work. It just means that we won't 100% know the absolute strength of any one unit until the points costs are out. Let's jump into it though, and we'll start off with new style Sanguinary Guard. This will be the datasheet for fielding your wingless wonders in game. At 10th launch they were really quite overcosted. A couple of points decreases saw them move to more sort of usable, though probably weren't the strongest of the Blood Angels jump troops. We'll see how they fare now they've got shiny new Primaris models. The box set has been dropped to there's only 3 in a box, so you're now able to field them in squad sizes of 3 or 6. But their stat lines have been increased as a result. Previously they had 2 wounds and now they have 3, and they've also gained a 4+ invulnerable save on top of the 2+ armor save that they had already. It perhaps makes them feel almost a bit like flying Terminators now. They're just 1 pip of toughness off that, I guess. Durability wise they're going to be at least kind of similar against small arms or really high AP things, though it does mean that just a few really big shots could wipe out the unit a little bit faster than previously. For their ranged weapons, you get Angelic bolt guns for the vast majority of the unit. It looks like you can only take 1 Inferno pistol per unit. Not sure why it isn't 1 per 3 on that front there. And there's no options for Power Fist or Plasma pistols, as you don't get them in the box. They do, however, have a fairly fun war gear choice. You've now got the option between taking the entire squad with Oncarmin blades or Oncarmin spears. It's one or the other for the entire unit. Essentially you have to choose between whether you want a bit more AP and 1 additional attack from the blade, or the lance keyword from the spear. The two are at least fairly well balanced, I think, where they aren't really significantly behind each other. For the most part though, against the majority of targets, I think you're going to wind up being better off with the blade. The extra AP is good against things where the AP matters, and the extra attack is a reliable damage boost against everything, where lance is okay, but it's only majorly relevant on the charge, and also more relevant against things that you're wounding on a 5. It does mean they should be fairly scary in combat though. For the blade it means that they're now strength 6 and AP 3, where previous Sanguinary Guard was strength 5 and AP 2. Otherwise, for their supporting rules, each time melee attack targets the units you get -1 to hit, and then they get their -1 to wound in melee as well if a character is leading the squad. Previously that had to be a warlord, but now you could have multiple units still triggering that -1 to wound roll. I feel like maybe it's a little bit of a shame that it's only melee attacks that defends against. A lot of similar rules work against ranged for sort of bodyguard style units. I guess between those two rules though, it does mean that they're going to be a real challenge to take out in melee. Otherwise, for supporting rules, a captain model can attach to them if they could join assault intercessors with jump packs, so jump captains can fight alongside, and 1 model can take the sanguinary banner per unit. It looks like you can take that whether they've got a blade or spear, even if the one that has it modelled I think has a spear on it. Overall the unit profile looks absolutely fine. It is just really going to come down to points as to how strong they are. The book has them listed at 150 points, which I think for their new profile might just be a little bit on the costly side. I feel like they probably should be more towards the 135 or 140 points. I guess we'll see what they come out with in the Blood Angels Codex, but in any case there's going to be loads of interest for them, given that they can take a full squad worth of damage to weapons, which now basically no other jump units can. Next up, let's take a look at the ranks of Death Company. First up, we'll start with the standard Death Company Marines, which are essentially Death Company Assault Intercessors now pretty much, and they've separated the Primaris datasheets. So there's now these which are the standard Marines, and then there's the Marines with bolt rifles, which are the sort of regular intercessor version of the Death Company. They've got a pretty standard Space Marine stat line with Objective Control 1. Obviously the Objective Control goes down to 0 due to Black Rage if they don't have chaplains nearby, and then beyond that they essentially feel like an Assault Intercessor squad but with extras, and beefed up with the Black Rage buffs of re-rolling hits in melee and the Feel No Pain 6+. It looks like the majority of them are still taking chainswords. You can get one of those new Eviscerators per 5, and that's essentially going to be hitting with average results that are kind of similar to a Power Fist, just with a little bit less strength. 3 attacks hitting on a 4+ at Strength 7, AP 2 and Damage 2, but getting sustained hits 1. Still quite a nice general purpose mid-strength weapon there. Then one model can take either a Power Fist or Thunderhammer per unit, and then one model per unit can take a fancy pistol as well. So an Inferno pistol, Plasma pistol or Hand Flamer. The unit doubles down on the damage buffs as the squad gets depleted. If they're below starting strength they get sustained hits 1, if they're below half strength they get sustained hits 2. I guess for these guys in the Death Company detachment they're going to be getting some pretty crazy danger happening if there say 2 of them left, maybe one with an Eviscerator and one with a Power Fist. 4 rerolls to hit and wound and sustained hits 2 does seem kind of mad, but again it is a rule that is necessary for them to have taken damage to trigger, and that does have downsides. Overall I guess that these guys are mainly going to be competing against things like Assault Intercessors, maybe jumping out of Impulsors, maybe led by a Chaplain. I feel like it might partly depend on points as to what works better for that, but I feel like the gap's likely going to have narrowed with these guys getting access to an Eviscerator in the unit. It does mean that compared with Assault Intercessors, they can have both a Power Fist and an Eviscerator, whereas the Assault Intercessors only get a Power Fist, even if they do have some other good advantages. Otherwise, as mentioned, the other Death Company on foot are the Intercessor pattern that can take the regular bolt rifles. These were kind of rarely used before, even if they were a somewhat interesting option with a bit of small arms fire, and being unusually punchy in combat. Pre-Codex they were really cheap at 75 points per 5. They used to be called Death Company Intercessors, now they're renamed Death Company Marines with bolt rifles, and the squad has had a few interesting updates. As with the Assault version, one model per 5 can take an Eviscerator, which I think is probably worth doing. It means that they're not really going to be too different in terms of melee threats to the Assault version, but just backing up with a few guns and a different special rule. The bolt rifles that you do take now have the Assault and Heavy keywords like the regular Intercessors. For some reason they were missing them before, so I guess that's one small benefit to their ranged firepower. They can still take an Astartes grenade launcher on one with a bolt rifle for a little bit more special weapon kind of threat. And finally their Visions of Heresy special rule was boosted. Previously this was just free Overwatch, not nothing but not the most impactful given just a smattering of bolt shots. Now it's been improved and expanded. Once per turn they can either use the Fire Overwatch or Heroic Intervention stratagem completely for free, and then when you do so you get to re-roll the hits in Overwatch or re-roll the charges if you're heroically intervening. With 4 reroll hits on offer, I feel like that makes the free Overwatch just a little bit more tempting. I guess you're likely to cause at least a few chip casualties to lighter infantry you might take aim at. It still does feel like perhaps a little bit of a weird hybrid unit though, doing a bit of range and a bit of melee, and not getting on any objective control unless you have chaplains nearby. Still not sure how often they're going to be running competitive list, even with all these fun advantages, but they seem perfectly playable casually. Next for the Death Company, we've got the Death Company Marines with jump packs. Pre-Codex they had their firstborn models and were a massive 140 points per 5 of them, though that was with getting mass Power Fist on offer, which they can't take quite as exclusively now, so I'd expect that the points would probably decrease a little bit on them. Again, they've basically got the same sort of profile as Jump Intercessors, but getting Black Rage for the Feel No Pain, and the built-in reroll hits in melee. If anything, I was actually perhaps kind of pleasantly surprised as to how many dangerous melee weapons the squad can take. For some reason they've looked at and they can take one more Power Fist per 5 than the on-foot version. Not entirely sure of the reasoning for that, but it basically means that per 5 of them you can get one Eviscerator, one Power Fist or Power Weapon per 5 models, one Plasma Pistol per 5 models, and then one sort of Sergeant option model with a Power Fist and fancy pistol of some sort. So another Plasma Shot, Inferno Pistol or Hand Flamer. Between all that, I guess that's 9 sort of near power fist profile type attacks, or re-rolling hits coming out of a 5-man unit of these, plus a couple of chainswords. Still means they should be at least fairly nicely threatening against enemy elites and vehicles. Otherwise, as with the rest, they've got the Black Rage downsides. Black Rage only works in melee now. They gain the Tacticus and Death Company keywords, and they still have the same special rule of Berserk Fury, re-rolling charge rolls made for the units. Again, going to be entirely points cost dependent, but I feel like they could be another very important unit, maybe somewhere between a squad of Assault Intercessors with jump packs and a squad of Sanguinary Guard in terms of the sort of threat profile they have. Then before we take a look at characters, we've got the 2 Blood Angels vehicles, and first up we have the Death Company Dreadnought. As anticipated, this one basically gains the Brutalis Dreadnought stat line, so the same one as the Redemptor but without the -1 damage, 12 wounds at toughness 10 with a 2+ save, and a big 8-inch move for him to stomp towards melee up the board. Quite a nice chunky profile, and a good one for using Armour of Contempt, and as Death Company he gets the 6+ Feel No Pain as well. For his wargear profile, it's essentially identical to the Brutalis, lightly taking a pair of twin multi-melters on the chest guns for a fairly savage amount of high AP shooting as he closes in. He gets the twin Icarus Iron Health Heavy Stubber as the top gun for a little bit of volume fire. And then for his primary weapon choice, he has the option between Brutalis Fists or Brutalis Talons. The choice is that the Fists get some built-in bolt rifles with a little bit more twin-linked AP1 volume fire. Or the Talons get a sweep mode, so 10 attacks at strength 7, AP2, damage 1, twin linked. The core profile for him is pretty scary either way though. 6 attacks hitting on a 3 at strength 12, AP2 and damage 3, and due to being the Death Company version, that'll be re-rolling all those hit rolls. They're just going to be incredibly reliable, re-rolling all hits and re-rolling all wounds. Out of the 2 options, it's probably going to make sense to go Talons, I guess, given that you've got the big hit re-rolls on offer already. So that's probably going to make the sweep mode more reliable versus the extra few bolt shots. Finally, compared with the Brutalis, it's got the traded out special rule of Driven by Fury. This one gives it a sort of surge move type rule. In the enemy shooting phase, if the unit is hit by a shooting attack, once per phase it can move d6 plus 2 inches, going as close as possible to the nearest enemy unit aside from aircraft, provided the Death Company Dreadnought isn't either battle shocked or locked in melee already. I believe that move would allow it to basically move into engagement range with enemy units. It doesn't actually explicitly say in the rule, but I believe that it should be able to, as it doesn't specify the move being a normal move or anything like that. So my guess is it probably wouldn't have the same restrictions as that, and it could mean that you could make melee. Kind of nice that it just triggers if you're hit by anything, whether or not it actually takes any damage, which is good. And could mean that this thing is an enormously scary threat on the mid-board objectives. Means that you can't just have an enemy unit trot up to the midfield objective and take it off him, and then shoot the Death Company Dreadnought with something else, unless whatever's on the midfield objective could afford to be locked up with a Death Company Dreadnought in close combat with all of those scary attacks. Overall looks fun on paper. It's going to be having the same sort of issues as the Brutalis Dreadnought though. Absolutely great if it makes melee with meaningful things, kind of lackluster if it gets screens or gets focused down and gunned down early. Otherwise, and still being the firstborn unit that's clicking on in the Codex, is the Baal Predator, the Blood Angel's pattern of the vehicle with the overcharged engines, and the options for twin assault cannons on the turret, the big flamestorm cannon, and heavy flamer sponsons as well. In the Codex it's mainly unchanged, arguably one slight buff. It moves fast with 12 inches movement, 11 wounds at toughness 10, so a fairly standard Predator stat line for the defense, and most people tend to run the Baal Flamestorm cannon for d6 plus 3 attacks at strength 6, AP2, damage 2, ignoring cover, quite nasty against medium infantry in the midboard, and particularly good with Overwatch, particularly if you pair it with heavy flamers. The change for the vehicle is that all the sponsons and turret weapons gain the assault keyword just at base now. Previously it was part of the special rule where you only gained assault if you were attacking infantry units, so now there's a bit less trade-off with being able to advance and shoot. You can just advance and then re-roll the advance roll due to overcharged engines rule pretty much most of the time. The only trade-off is that you wouldn't be able to use the supporting weapons, so the Hunter-Killer missile and the Storm Bolter bolted on top. Overall though, not too massively changed. They have been used in competitive lists, and quite a nice mid-board shooting unit to try and burn down enemy objective grabbers. If you liked it before, then you'll like it now. Finally, let's move on to the characters. We'll start out with the epic heroes, then talk through the few generic datasheets. First up, we've got the main man and Lord Regent of the Imperium Nihilus, Commander Dante himself. Pre-Codex, he was 120 points. Fairly well balanced for what he brought to the table, I thought. A big Space Marine Chapter Master style profile with toughness 4, 6 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and moving around very fast on a jump pack of course. For his war gear he gets a boosted d6 damage Inferno pistol and then the Axe Mortalis. This one's now been slightly improved in the Codex. It's 8 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 with lethal hits. Pre-Codex it was only strength 7. I think that strength 8 is quite a good breakpoint, means you're wounding standard Space Marine equivalents on a 2+, and then in the Liberator's detachment you get up to strength 10, which again is pretty big for things like medium vehicles. Otherwise he's also got one small buff to his special rules. Previously he gave you +1 to charge rolls and +1 to hit for the unit that he is leading. Now on top of that he also gives you +1 to advance as well, and that's massively important with his unit being able to get advance and charge in Liberators or in Angelic Host. An extra 2 inches on top of that advance roll and a charge is massive. It means that his unit could be reliably charging around about 24 inches or so across the tabletop, which is big. The +1 to charge, as mentioned, could also be handy enough with the redeploys from Angelic Host. Means that you could have an 8-inch charge, maybe command point re-rolling it out of Deep Strike, so at least a better chance than most to make it out of that, even if it's not super reliable. Otherwise, his Death Mask of Sanguinius still triggers a Battle Shock test with -1 to the test at the start of the fight phase. Usually not the most meaningful thing in the world, but could occasionally help stop the enemy scoring some objectives or stop them using an important damage dealer stratagem, so I guess it's a nice to have. Overall I felt he was usable enough before, I'm sure he probably will still be now. He can still choose to lead either Assault Intercessors with jump packs, Vanguard Veterans or Sanguinary Guard, and seems like a nice addition to any of those really. For our other Golden Angel of the Codex we've got the Sanguinor, 140 points for the Golden Lone Operative, kind of similar in stat lines to Dante but with +1 wounds. His melee weapon is really quite similar as well, only strength 6 rather than 8 and getting devastating wounds rather than lethal hits, but fairly similar. Basically in terms of special rules it looks like the Sanguinor is pretty much identical to how he was before. It looks like he's just gained the Tacticus keyword, and besides that things are the same. He has that really quite devastating special rule where if he's in reserves he can basically step into combat as if he's doing a heroic intervention, just casually turning up, usually to save a Blood Angels unit that was just getting charged by the enemy, and because he has fights first he gets to strike before them, hopefully cutting down a good number of the enemy before they even get to strike and making a massive swing in the combat. Beyond that he can just be a pretty massively dangerous lone operative with fights first, though interestingly enough not the only one that Blood Angels have on the go now. And he also inspires Blood Angels nearby a bit for re-rolling some Battle Shock or Leadership tests, which I guess can help out, though is a little bit more situational. He was certainly used in plenty of competitive lists before, and I'm sure he still will be. He does have some pretty powerful rules. Next up, we have Chief Librarian Mephiston, who actually seems to have a pretty similar kind of battlefield role to the Sanguinor now. He's also a scary Blood Angels melee character with lone operative and fights first. That's a big change on where he was previously. Previously he was joining things like Assault Intercessor squads and giving them fights first and lending a hand in close combat. Otherwise the Lord of Death has got a fairly chunky profile that's quite hard to take down. 6 wounds at toughness 5 with a 2+ save, but a big 4+ feel no pain. That means that on average the standard enemy units will have to take around about 12 wounds worth of toughness 5, 2+ save armor off him, so he's not going to be a lone operative that you're just going to be bumping off with casual small arms. Otherwise he strikes with his Fury of the Ancients attack, which might be good for killing a Space Marine or two, also gets to fire with his Plasma Pistol at the same time as they're both pistols, and then in melee he attacks with Viterus, which is 6 attacks at strength 9, AP 3, damage D3 and now lethal hits, so a small improvement to his melee threat there, and not really so very different in the threat that the Sanguinor and Dante have. Finally, his special rules have been completely changed as well. The quickening now gives him advance and charge as he just fights first at base. It does mean that he's going to be really quite quick moving around the board. And then Transfix Engage has been changed as well. It now means that while an enemy unit is within 6 inches, each time it's tested to fall back, they must do a leadership test. If they fail that test, then they have to remain stationary instead, which could be kind of massive in the wrong situation. Could potentially mean that he or another Blood Angels unit gets to kill one thing, consolidate into the next, and then stop it from falling back in the enemy turn if they get unlucky, stopping any more shooting at, say, Mephiston himself, and maybe getting you a bit more damage on the enemy with their fights first. Overall looks far more scary and more interesting than before. It does feel like you might have a bit more competition with the Sanguinor for which one you take, unless you want 2 fights first scary lone operatives on the board. I really wouldn't be too surprised if his points cost wind up going a little bit higher though when we get the Minotaur and Field Manual. He was only 100 points pre-Codex, the Codex points list him at 125, and I wouldn't be too surprised if it winds up being about that for his new abilities. Next up, we have the black-pinioned angel that is Astorath the Grim. The Blood Angel's chaplain-in-chief seems to have got a lot scarier in the book update. Previously he was 85 points, but it looks like he's a lot more dangerous. He's gained 6 attacks and strength 7 and precision on the Executioner's axe. Previously it was only 4 attacks, strength 6, AP 3, damage 2 and devastating wounds and no precision. That's really stepped him up quite a big gear there. A lot more effective against a lot more units. I feel like with that sort of volume of attacks there's a lot more chance that he might actually be able to snipe a character in one round of combat as opposed to just falling short against an invulnerable save or something. Otherwise he can only join Death Company Marines with jump packs. Maybe a little bit of a shame that he can't lead other units as well as the chaplain-in-chief, even if that is his primary role. His special rules are both pretty useful for them. He gives them a 4+ chance to fight on death if they hadn't already fought this phase. Definitely not too bad if his unit's being countercharged and wiped out in return after they've destroyed something of the enemy's. And Massive Doom got a big improvement as well. Previously it gave you devastating wounds just on 1 charge in the game. Now it gives you devastating wounds for his unit in melee whenever they make a charge move. That feels like a bit of a better rule overall. I feel like having his buffing rule just locked to 1 time in the game was just kind of sad. Previously he was very rarely taken in any sort of competitive list versus Lemartes. I feel like with those improvements though, people might well be taking a second glance at him, or points cost depending of course. Speaking of Lemartes, the other resculpted Blood Angel's chaplain was previously 120 points, and he tended to be the choice that people took with their Death Company. He fights with the Blood Crozius at 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 and lethal hits, so scary enough there. He'll be getting reroll to hits as he'll be joining the Death Company with their Black Rage rule. He has 6+ feel no pain himself, and then the main reason to take him are his 2 special rules, making Death Company both more dangerous and tougher. Guide of the Lost gives you -1 damage, so things like damage 3 attacks become survivable with the feel no pain, and damage 2 is basically halved. And then lethal hits in melee allow the squad to punch up against tougher stuff that bit better. Very nice for their mid-strength attacks with their power fists and the eviscerator that they'll get. Overall he was very good before, and I'm sure he'll remain a strong choice now. I guess the biggest change is that the maxed out Death Company squad that he'll be using won't have as many power fists or eviscerators to go around as it was before. Though I'd hope that that would also come with a points decrease. Might just mean that his unit is maybe a little bit more skewed in a bit more favour of durability over outright ridiculous damage. Though giving 4 rerolls to hit, lethal hits and still a bunch of power fists, it's still going to be nasty. Then we've got the generic options for the Blood Angels characters. 1 Sanguinary Priest and 3 different flavours of Captain. The Sanguinary Priest is a bit sad to have lost his jump pack option, though the on-foot version was also very viable alongside things like Assault Intercessors in particular. He only attacks with a chainsword in melee, so doesn't give a massive amount of damage there, but you really take him for his buffing rules, giving the unit a 5+ feel no pain, an extra AP to their melee weapons by 1, kind of like Lemartes, both making the squad more dangerous and also tougher to kill. That pairs really well with Assault Intercessors. Getting all those chainsword attacks to AP 2 is a big deal, and the 5+ feel no pain make them genuinely kind of annoying to remove from the board. For the Codex changes, they've updated the squad list that he can join in particular, though I still feel like Assault Intercessors are going to be the way to go. Most of the rest aren't really melee capable, and unfortunately he still can't lead Blade Guard. Otherwise his damage profile has just been slightly tweaked. Like Lemartes, he's gained an Absolver bolt pistol for the single shot being a strength 5, AP 1 and damage 2, so just a little bit more hitting power there. And his chainsword is just a tiny bit less accurate in combat. He hit on a 2+ before, but now he hits on a 3. Overall he still looks like an interesting unit, and he can still join squads if either captains or lieutenants are attached as well, so it does mean that you could have really quite a big threatening unit jumping out of say a Land Raider, or maybe an Impulsor now they've got 7 transport slots. Getting some extra fight and free stratagems from a captain, plus the extra AP and feel no pain from this guy, were quite a nice combo. Talking of captains, let's get into the new Blood Angels one, who feels like his datasheet is kind of similar to what they did with the Black Templar, Marshal and Castellan, essentially a Space Marine captain, but with a bit more different war gear options to represent the things that he has in the kit, like the chainsword and the Inferno pistol. My guess is he'll probably wind up being the same points cost as the regular captain on foot, who's 80 points currently. He has the same special rules with the finest hour for devastating wounds and +3 attacks once per game, and then the same Rites of Battle, which gives you 3 stratagems, but the balanced data slate makes it so it reduces the cost of a stratagem by 1 command point now. That thankfully is no longer locked to battle tactics, and that gives you plenty of options in these detachments. For the squads he can lead, they're most of the ones you'd expect, but he can't lead either Blade Guard or Hellblasters. I guess that's due to the captain restrictions in the core codex, meaning that the captain has to be the one with the fancy shield if he's leading the Blade Guard, or the one with the plasma pistol if he's leading Hellblasters. I must admit that does feel just a little bit annoying and arbitrary, really. I guess if you wanted to convert a Blade Guard leader one though, you could equip him with the Power Sword Relic Blade type thing, and maybe just give him one of the many spare Storm Shields that you get in the Blade Guard kit. Otherwise though, for leading Assault Intercessors into battle, it looks like he'll do fine. He can still take a Power Fist for 5 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2, Damage 2, even better with the Finest Hour. And the Inferno Pistol looks like a very reasonable choice as a small arm to have, only 6-inch range, but a pretty reasonable chance of frying an elite infantry or something. He also does get the profile for the Mastercrafted Chainsword, 7 attacks at Strength 4, AP 1 and Damage 2. Unfortunately, just the Strength and AP decrease over a Power Fist isn't going to make that the best choice. To be honest, in 40k it's usually made sense to upgrade to the Power Fist and the fancier melee weapons for captains, even when there was a points cost differential. Otherwise, perhaps the slight unexpected thing from the Codex was that they've given 2 different datasheets to Death Company captains. There's the version on foot, which essentially uses the exact same miniature as the Themed Blood Angels captain on foot, and therefore he gets basically the same war gear choices, just a bit of a twist on his special rules. Of course, he's going to be with the Death Company, so he can either lead Death Company Marines or the Death Company Marines with bolt rifles. For his special rules, he gets the Black Rage, so he'll be able to reroll hits in melee, which is nice. A 6+ feel no pain, though goes down to not being able to fall back and going to OC0 if there's no chaplains nearby, which I guess might be a bit more of a danger for him, because I guess if he's leading a Death Company unit, then it means that a chaplain won't be, so unless you have other ones nearby in other units, he might be out of that range. Otherwise though, his special rules are to grant Scout 6 inches to his Death Company on foot unit if they're not in a transport vehicle. I guess not the worst thing for moving them up to a staging post in a mid-board ruin, or just retreating out of line of sight if the enemy can see them. And then finally, both him and the Jump Pack Death Company captain get a rule called Death Visions of Sanguinius. If you get slain in melee, roll a dice and add 2 to the roll if the enemy warlord is in the unit that slayed him. On a 2 to 3, the enemy squad takes D3 mortal wounds, on a 4 to 5 they take 3, and on a 6 they take D3 plus 3. I guess it is quite a nice damage boost if he does get slain there, though I feel like it's not quite so much that you'd actually want him to get brought down. And to be honest, compared with a standard captain with 3 stratagems, it doesn't feel like he adds anywhere near as much value. As a result, I'd hope that he'd be fairly cheap, given that he's mainly being a cheap fighty melee character more than anything else, and I guess that Death Company captains are going to be most relevant in the actual Death Company detachments, where they're going to be the ones bearing the enhancements if you want them. Finally, we've just got the Jump Pack version of the same unit. His listed points are 100 points here, but as with the rest, it's likely not going to be the final ones. I certainly hope that he'd be cheaper than that. As with the on-foot version, he gets his 6+ feel no pain, re-rolling hit rolls in melee, Black Rage, and that same Death Visions of Sanguinius one. His boosting rule, though, is to give his unit sustained hits 1 when they're in melee. So I guess that's another direct damage boost to the rest of the unit. Realistically, though, I don't think that compares particularly favourable with things like taking a chaplain who gives you +1 to wound, plus helps ward off the Black Rage Death Company debuffs. So I guess this guy will fight quite hard with a Power Fist. He basically has the same equipment as the Jump Pack Captain datasheet, as that's the model that he uses. Again, I suppose probably going to be most relevant for bearing Death Company enhancements, if anything, and I'd hope that his datasheet is going to be kind of cheap, as he does have disadvantages versus the chaplains. In any case, that's the last of the unique Blood Angels characters, so I thought I'd finish up with a few initial impressions of the Codex in general. I must admit it's going to be a mixed blessing for lots of players out there. I feel like for the most part the actual rules that are in the Codex look like they're pretty good so far, though it's just a shame that they've lost really quite a fair few fun and flavourful units in the whole Primaris update, particularly the Librarian Dreadnought, Gabriel Seth, and the bespoke models for the Death Company. It's always a bit of a bitter pill to swallow when that happens, though I feel like the Blood Angels release has maybe had that exacerbated by a broadly kind of negative reception to the new Sanguinary Guard, and lacking an actual bespoke kit for the Death Company that isn't an upgrade sprue. I feel like if both of those units had been landed with really cool, nice updated miniatures, then there'd be far less of an outcry. Having said that, I feel like they've broadly done quite well with the new character sculpts, most of which I would rate as looking pretty nice personally, though obviously any one of them is a bit subjective. Rules wise though, at least initially, before we've got points cost, the book does look really quite strong. Blood Angels pre-Codex are pretty much at the top of the Warhammer 40k meta, really dangerous units bouncing around with jump packs deleting things, and even if you mainly use things like Vanguard Veterans and Jump Intercessors from the core Codex, Liberator Assault Group is already looking really nice. They've still got the big damage output from the core detachment rule. Red Rampage can still be just as scary, even if it's a little bit more nuanced than it was before, and they gain massive utility from Advance and Charge and the other shoot and charge options, plus really quite a good enhancement with the pop-up fights first once per game that could make one unit into a real headache. Beyond that, I think the Angelic host looks nice and pretty good fun, the Death Company one a bit undertuned maybe, and for the datasheets, broadly the vast majority of them all look like they're in a position to be really quite strong with the right points cost, though we'll have to see what Games Workshop delivers on that front as always. Kind of a bit tricky to be too positive about any one datasheet when they might do what they did with the Vindicator Assassin, give it massively upgraded rules, but then double its points cost to the point where the upgraded rules don't matter. If they keep things broadly where they were though, I feel like the vast majority will be playable, and nice to see two of the lesser played options in Mephiston and Astorath actually getting really quite big and impactful changes to their datasheets, so maybe we might see a bit more of them. I feel like perhaps the more niche units might be the Death Company Captains and the Bolt Rifle version of the Death Company, and I really hope that they manage to get both Sanguinary Guard and the Primaris Jump Death Company both in the place where the points will allow them to be strong units. I feel like they're probably the sort of thing that lots of Blood Angels players would like to be building around, and there's going to be a massive role for Jump Intercessors both in Sons of Sanguinius and the Angelic Host, where they both stand out amazing units there. Let me know your thoughts though, certainly a bit of rough and smooth with this one. Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments, and if I've missed anything or got any rules wrong, I'll leave them updated in a pinned correction comment. As mentioned earlier, if you were looking to pick up the new Death Company box set at the weekend with the Codex, the new Chaplains, and the Primaris with the Death Company upgrades, then feel free to check out the links down in the video description, where they can be obtained a fair bit cheaper than Games Workshop. Element Games in the UK tend to have them at 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 21%, Fenris Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal in the USA for 15%, and Tash and Geldeep in Germany should have them for 20%. Here are the pre-order times, and as mentioned, doesn't hurt to be early to these ones if you do definitely want to pick up a copy. No idea whether they'll actually sell out or not this time round, but often the ones that go at discount retailers tend to move faster than the ones from Games Workshop's web store, so if you've already decided that you are definitely picking one up, then probably best to be early than later, all things being equal. For release dates, it should be going live at midnight Eastern Time for Wargame Portal in the USA and Fenris Workshop in Canada, 10 AM UK time for Element Games, midday Australian Eastern Time for Gap Games, and then 11 AM Central European Time for Tash and Geldeep in the EU. A massive thank you to anyone using those links when they pick up Warhammer models. It does help to support the channel and keep all the big reviews like this one coming. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll be interested to hear what you guys make of the book down in the comments below. I'll certainly look forward to covering the Blood Angels points when we get them here on the channel. That'll be the way that we can finally put the units into context for competitive lists, and again talk about some army lists when we get them. As ever, feel free to check out the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support the channel a bit more directly. It is the main thing that keeps me doing this full time. But in any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll be hoping to see you guys in the next video.